Hi, everybody, and welcome to Meyer Media. From cost center to business driver, we're actually tackling how to evolve FinOps to a strategic business function. Joining us today is Chris, the founder of CloudScale. Chris, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Chris, what's your role at CloudScale?
So I am one of the founders of CloudScale. We started this whole kind of initiative about 3 years ago to help customers, as we've seen, and we're probably, each one of us are about 10-year practitioners in the AWS world, and how they struggled with that transition from the buyers to the buyers of AWS from the traditional builders.
Well, Chris, FinOps is changing, or it really kind of needs to change the business function. AWS spending, we all know, is an obvious part of any ecosystem out there and for customers. While cost optimization needs to actually be a constant focus, there needs to be some business function or driving value behind it. Talk to me a little bit more about the importance of why a mature FinOps processes are so critical for businesses.
Absolutely. So, like you stated, getting out of the box, people needed to make sure they weren't wasting money, using cost optimization. They absolutely need to continue on that continuum, have those groups. But as we move this to, much like, actually, I use the analogy of like security, right? We used to joke, we have a security group, we have a couple of people on the third floor. Now, 20 years later, it's now everyone's responsibility. And that same is true with FinOps, right? And so as we transition from people solely focusing on how do I turn the rag, get as much waste out of my AWS spending, into how do I now move to that next generation, that decentralized model where the business owner, the product owners, and their organization have accountability over their AWS spending. Those are the things that we've really worked hard to sort of define those processes.
Chris, let me ask you your experience, your expertise on it around FinOps. You talked about security being everybody's job function.
Yep.
I remember actually having a separate security division. They managed the firewalls, they managed all the access to it. You had your admins that did all the work. When you come to FinOps, is it really everybody's responsibility when they're deploying infrastructure to be aware of it? Is FinOps going to be changing back to cloud financial management? What's your thoughts on this?
So, you know, there are a number of questions that we kind of jokingly put out there, but one of them is always, so what did we think this would cost, right? And that is a little bit of like, that will take everyone's legs off, right? No one wants to answer that question. And the reason why is because maybe perhaps if they were working with a particular partner or a funding program, et cetera, they built that estimate associated to that workload, but that linked to that particular pricing calculator or however they built it, that's a memory, right? And so we really need to put some rigor around, or at least build applications or ways to coalesce around what is my estimate for that particular workload, and then trace it through the process. And then even use things like new tooling, not just BI, but also the generative BI and generative AIs to be able to interrogate those things, but from birth to grave, right? What was that estimate? What was the ramp of that estimate? Is it taking advantage of all the different programs? But make that a business function, not something where I have to send an email, send an email, send an email, and then I get it back 5 days later. And we're taking up and consuming a lot of time of our highest paid or our highest cost resources, our cloud engineers, right? So how do we move that into the business?
Chris, is FinOps a short-term or long-term business strategy or function?
It's turning into, if it's not there already, 60% or more of people's IT spend. Right, and we're not going back. Actually, if organizations don't start getting these processes and these cost controls together, like potentially it will go back, right? You do hear people saying, I tried that, it was the wild, wild west. The only way for me to actually not, turn the lights off, and this is particularly true with AI. You start driving those AI workloads, and you didn't have mature processes and being able to handle things that were on a smaller compute process. These new NVIDIA and all these other things, like that's 10x, right? These things are going to get away very quickly unless you have mature processes. So it's not going away. And I think for continued cloud adoption without the right cost governance together, then unfortunately, a lot of people's cloud journeys may even come to an end because the business is going to say, you know what, I don't trust you anymore. We're bringing it back on-prem.
I find it interesting that people don't realize that when you go to the cloud, it's anybody can deploy something. Back then, you used to procure something that lasts 5 years, and we're still talking about this 10, 15 years down the road where cloud has already exists. Older, more mature companies don't realize that when you go to the cloud, you have to have some processes in place. You have to have plans in place to do it. Chris, you actually have a product or a service called the FinOps Center. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, right? So when we looked at this, initially going back again 5 years, the initial kind of problem domain was customers saying, hey, listen, I've got this 100-page AWS bill that I've got to figure out a way to truncate down, put it into some sort of a format to get back into my workday or however I accrued cost. The reality is what they didn't mean, or what they didn't say with that, was approved and validated data, right? And going back 20 years in a lot of my career, we were building process applications. And it's because you couldn't just integrate data from point A to point B, because there needed to be approvals and things of that data before it went into that system. So while we had initial sort of versions or ideas around FinOps Center to take in things like the cost and usage report and then just really map it to particular cost centers, et cetera, and then expose those files so that they can be consumed for back-end systems, we really realized that, hang on a second here, there's actually a lot of actors that are going to want to be involved. There are a lot of processes that need to be approved through that whole life cycle to get to that point where we can generate that file to get back and then not make it a situation where, one of the crazy parts about where people are, large organizations that we deal with, no one touches or even has any knowledge about their particular part of the AWS bill until a week after the company's paid it, right?
And that's 10 days after the actual bill comes out, so now you're halfway or quarter way through the month.
And it can be worse, right? If you use and you should, right? If you use a value-added reseller, any part of that process, the reality is it's actually 60 days, right? And so when we looked at it, and actually, a lot of the example, if we go back to 25 years ago, the last time we went for a revolution of moving from fixed to variable cost with consulting, right? We used to look at it in a shop, and most people would be W-2 employees. That's not true anymore, right? And I will tell you, you will get some very angry phone calls. I was in the consulting business for a long time, right? When you are sending invoices based that they had budgeted 160 hours, and you send an invoice for a consultant that worked 200 hours, right? It's the same type of paradigm, and we're just trying to take some of those lessons of how we got that cost governance, right, and bring that into this thing called the AWS bill.
Chris, I like that example of the consultant. I was actually a contractor, a consultant for a company, and while we were like 40 hours, they're like, hey, we need you to work more for it. I'm like, yeah, sure, no problem. But when they realize it, somebody else who's paying the bill, they realize it. Talk to me a little bit more about the FinOps Center. How is that actually different from the other tools that are out in the market? Because in the last year alone, there have been, I'm going to say, if I said, less than 20 tools, I'd be lying. It was probably 30 or 40 tools for FinOps. How is FinOps Center different?
Well, first thing is we don't focus on cost optimization. We don't really kind of focus on the two personas, the top of the organization, FinOps organization, and maybe the individual product owner. We focus on all the people in between, right? So how are you building your estimates and have a process application around your AWS spending? And we actually put off kind of, bootstrapping and building this. We're like, there's no way someone's one of these guys that are in the world around cost optimization, they're eventually going to realize, like, hang on a second here, there are a lot of processes that are not being served. And then eventually no one served it, right?
So no one was actually building or even thinking about doing this.
About it.
And some of the major the companies out there, you're like, why are they not doing it? Like, it's an obvious thing to you, but not them?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's all where you come from, right?
Yeah.
And so personally and within our group, right, we were building process applications for Wall Street really for 20 years, right? So when we looked at what the problem domain was, it was, like I said before, right, it's a process. And then one of the challenges with processes, and I think maybe to better answer your question, is when you look at processes and you start down the road of saying, hey, what is my process around this stuff? People have nowhere to start, It's a very kind of like, I'm going to build a swim lane, I'm going to go on the whiteboard, et cetera. The reality is the business, they understand screens. They don't understand process, right? And so when we looked at all the complexity around, even within the console, and one thing I always joke, like, the business has no business, or no business in the console because they have no business in the console, right?
Yep.
And so when you think about from a top-down perspective, what are these different personas? What are the screens that they need, with enough information? Now that enough information has really changed a bunch because, we had to do some product re-engineering because with the advent of generative AI, and particularly with generative BI with Amazon Q and QuickSight, the scope by which the business can understand this data has a greater aperture, right? So we built and kind of just recently announced the Amazon Q and QuickSight FinOps Center framework, where we actually integrate Q&A functionality into FinOps Center. So when you are a business owner and you're working within your process, I kind of internally, I call it the Nirvana pattern, because we're basically bringing everything together. When we were building process applications, we always used to have to navigate to that BI report to get that piece of information to take an action on something. Now it's right in the screen. So you can sit there, what was my spending on this particular thing last month, right? And you just ask the question and it produces the information, not just in a text format or dialogue format, but then the visualization associated with that. And we've been working very closely with the Amazon Q and the QuickSight team to provide that functionality.
So Chris, you're pulling in all this information,
Yep.
all the various stuff that they go to from not only the console, but all their BI reports, because we know that an engineer is not looking at the BI report, right? He doesn't go to BI to actually, but now they can see it within the console. The manager can see it in it.
Well, within the application, not the console.
Well, within the, so within your console, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's my reference there, is that now you're giving them the ability to not only use AWS tools like Amazon Q, ask them various questions to it, just like they would normally do to any other thing. They would try to search around, start clicking on it, but now they can ask a normal, hey, what's my top spend today, or what's happening? What are my top ones that are doing it? How does your FinOps Center look and compare to CloudScale's strategy and roadmap?
Yeah, no, we have a lot of, so one of the interesting things that we've done is we've started on AWS, right? As opposed to some other people in the industry as well, it's distributed through the AWS marketplace. It's not a SaaS offering. It actually installs inside of a customer's cloud estate. So it's 100% serverless. It's actually quite magical, if you ask me, right? Because you run your CloudFormation script. You do ask a couple of parameters that are specific to your organization. You add your budget information from your bag legacy system. You hit a couple buttons, and it deploys inside of your environment. And then the next generation, or everything around CloudScale, as you were asking, right? It's like, what are the, if we think about, and we say with FinOps Center, we kind of tongue-in-cheek a little bit, it's cloud financial management for the humans, right? Because this stuff is really hard, right? And so if you look at what other things we'll do, right? It's what are these challenges like that need to be solved by the non-unicorn community, right? Yep. And right now, particularly in FinOps, you need to know a little bit about financial management. You need to know a little bit, you need to be a little bit of a cloud engineer, right? And that's kind of the analogy around unicorns. Like, these people don't really exist. And so it's really a bit probably strategically bad to just constantly say, I'm going to, when all these challenges come up around AI and all the rest, right, is like, oh, don't worry about it. I'm going to find a unicorn, right, that's going to help solve my problems. Terrible idea, right? And particularly as you scale and you want to, push this stuff out to the organization, which really kind of talks to kind of a decentralized model, all that's going to have to be solved by processes. And so as we go in different directions, the next year, the next thing, actually one thing that we're working on right now, which is a massive thing within customers, even if we stay within the AWS domain, is around the migration acceleration program, as a for instance, right? MAP, right? And we talk to a lot of large organizations. If you think about MAP, right, you have a business owner that has a particular workload that they're looking to migrate to AWS, and they build a business case associated with that based on credits that they'll receive from AWS. And they have really no way, at a product level perspective, of knowing where they are in their accrual, what their credit expectation should be.
Yep.
Right? So we have a process that will be deployed early next year around that. right?
How are you handling, so I know the biggest thing with MAP is tagging, right? That's the only way to actually identify the resources that moved over, and you get the credits based off of the year of the migration and how long it's in. How are you planning to handle tagging and making sure that those resources are accurately reported so that you do get your credits?
Absolutely, right. So great question. So because we're installed inside of the customer's delegated admin account, that's the same place you put like Security Hub and some other things within your cloud estate. Then we have a mechanism for the business, again, to define their workloads that are MAP, associated to a contract, the resources associated to those workloads, and then every night we look at if there's any new resources, and then we write just a script into Systems Manager that goes and applies those to the resources that may not, we've deduced have not had those tags. And then we start tracking those resources from those days forward through Amazon Q and QuickSight, so that you can just ask a question, where am I in my accrual, what's my expected credits, right? And then we have a way to reconcile the credits at a, not at an account level, which is problematic, but actually at a cost center level. Right, so that's how we handle that.
I bet you AWS is going to like this. This is probably a top topic for them.
A lot of really interesting things, right? And it's because they were, in general, they were always builder focused, and they are still builder focused. I'm not suggesting that they're not, but as we kind of get forward here, we're in a competitive market, right? And well, we're all in a competitive market, but they're in a competitive market, right? And you have to win the business. Right? And you have to win the buyers. So we are a tool for the buyers, right? As that transition comes from who are making the decisions around AI, where are these workloads being deployed? Is that going to be a builder decision or is that going to be a buyer decision? And we're banking, or we're solving for that it's going to be a buyer's decision.
Chris, I'm going to bring us back to a little bit more on the FinOps topic in the FinOps Center. One of the important questions out there is that FinOps is still new, right? So it went from cloud financial management to FinOps, more of a processes. There are new companies trying to implement it. What's the importance of having a mature FinOps process within your company, or at least a strategy to get there?
Yeah, it's and what we're solving for, and what, again, going back a little bit to our history, right? You will find for a very long time, I always kind of a little bit of like joke, processes were always, and if you can think about this not applying to a better thing like the AWS bill, but when we talked about process, we did a lot of fancy things. We called them very fancy things, to make a lot of money and to make us feel good about ourselves. But at the end of the day, we built web applications around data people argued about, right? And if you can find a better example than the AWS bill that fits that category, right? But as that point, but going back a little bit, we talked about, is we need to, as customers continue their cost optimization, they say the next thing here is to move to a decentralized model. That all sounds great, but you need an application. And again, in my experience, if you go back to any of the process applications over the last 20 years, the buying decision around that was it enabled a particular business to adopt an application for everyone to coalesce around, right? You have a CCOE, right, which turns out to be centers of mediocrity versus excellence, right? But
I like that.
Right, but the reality is you had people that were bestowed around something, but then they had no enforcement mechanism out to the business for anyone to do anything, and so they just kind of muddled about, right? And so you need to have, and so they built, the whole BPM thing was really around, okay, I need to operationalize these processes and then provide the governance associated for these people that are the overlords, right? But they're making sure that people are doing what they're supposed to do. And that's what we're trying to achieve with FinOps Center.
Chris, how are you tackling, or how are you looking at the challenges for companies implementing FinOps that need or have signed up for various tools, right? So a lot of the FinOps tools have their own niche, there's expertise.
Yep.
Not only, cost savings, AWS savings plans, they're dedicated to AWS, Azure, I need one, I'm a multi-cloud,
Yep.
I want to look on-prem onto it. I have all this data, all this stuff out there, including my AWS bill, and all these various accounts. The problem I see with a lot of companies is they have 20 tools to solve their FinOps problem, and they're probably spending as much on that as anything else.
Yeah, they're paying a fortune, right? And so, we're a bit of a niche play right now in the AWS world. We'll be less of a niche play as we bring on more of the hyperscalers.
Yep.
The FinOps organization and what they've done with Focus has made our life a little bit easier, right? Because
simplifying the definition, not only the billing methodology that's going,
but just
the
like
terms,
the schemas, right? Because at the end of the day, we bring in through S3 into our Dynamo table so that the processes can execute against this data, right? And then do what we do, and then export out. And when you have to do this. When you have to ingest that data from 20 different formats, it's daunting, if not impossible, so we punted on it, right? In addition to being a partner with AWS, providing AWS sellers a unique proposition, right? Or selling here's a tool to help you sell to the buyers, and oh, by the way, like, they can't do that on the other, we don't have that yet, right? But because when we're a scrappy, small, bootstrap company, right? And so you have to activate sales forces, right? Or all these things cost money, right? So that was kind of our strategic thing with that. I'm sorry, I forgot maybe the.
So you're all into AWS right now.
Right now, we're all in
you're
AWS.
Looking to expand into the hyperscalers.
We are, but
as things progress, right?
But just think about it, right? So we have how many hundreds of thousands of customers, and how unsuccessful do we need to be very successful, right? I mean, that's
can
the truth.
Stay focused on AWS, because right now, and it's still out there known that it's like only 3% of the on-prem actually moves to the cloud. There are still so much out there that need to move and focus. In fact, I'm all in AWS. I love working with them and everything. So you can stay focused on that. And as things expand.
Yeah, and the thing that's different from us, and again, I don't want to be disparaging against anyone, but from a revenue and a licensing model, we're a term license, right? So you can get started for free for up to 10 AWS accounts. FinOps in a box is up to 25 accounts, and that's $25,000 a year. And then kind of enterprise, all you can need is $85K a year. And some of the other business models that I'm aware of in the organization is, we're taking percentage of billing and stuff like that. You don't have to worry about that. We're a flat rate. You use our technology.
That's actually pretty good, because most people are a percentage.
And I can very confidently say, and it's been justified with a lot of friends that we value a lot, right? And plus we did it, right? To get to build a application. So getting back to a little bit, like how would a company even build this thing, right? Where would you start, right? And I can tell you would start and get to where you could be in 2 hours with FinOps Center in about 18 months and $2 million, right? That's what you could do. That's what you could do, right? If you chose, but I don't think people do. And then in future releases, we have some things that we're thinking through on the source control management perspective. But FinOps Center, it's a full stack application. It's a React front end with Lambda and step functions in the middle with DynamoDB. So it's 100% serverless in addition to the framework for the Amazon Q. You can build your own topics. You can integrate them. We have all the administrative screens. And if you want, because it is a React application, down the road when we come up with a better strategy around it, you'll be able to customize even your front end if that's something you want.
Chris, I got to wrap things up. Where can people go to find out more information?
Absolutely. You can go to finopscenter.com. And you can find us on the AWS Marketplace. Oh,
that's actually a good place. I got plenty of topics for the AWS Marketplace. All right, everybody, this has been Myer Media. I'm your host, Jon Myer. Don't forget to hit that like, subscribe, and notify, because guess what? We're out of here.